In December of 2019, I wrote an article for the Sowetan newspaper attempting to express my gratitude for unapologetically black literary spaces like the Abantu Book Festival, publishers like Blackbird Books, and bookstores like Zara Books. This was a difficult piece for me to write because I had to take myself back to a strange but exciting time in my life where I developed as a person in ways I never thought were necessary. It was a time in my life when I formed relationships that have made a major impact on the person I am becoming. This was also a time in my life where my ability to endure mental, psychological, emotional, and spiritual hardship and abuse was stretched to breaking point. During this time, when I was not arguing with my history tutors about why the articles the department has assigned to us to engage with the history of the Vietnam War, or China, or the Middle East were all coming from white academics working at British and American institutions, I was being told by a physics lecturer that what he was teaching us was so Eurocentric that there was nothing African knowledge systems could contribute. And on one occasion, my fellow students and I were exposed to traumatizing representational violence by a white lecturer who did not have the necessary skills to lead a compassionate and thoughtful class discussion on an art exhibition that had black people on display in museums in the same way we had been displayed in European and American zoos not too long ago. In the 6 years that I was a student at Wits University, I only ever felt like I belonged when I was a student of the African Literature department. Of course, like everything in life, this department is not perfect. But unlike most university departments, they had us, the students, engaging with some of the problematic issues, the challenges, and the triumphs of the department and its place in the university from the very first lecture. What made me feel so at home in this department was the fact that I did not have to hide parts of myself or pretend that I was someone else. It was here that my opinions mattered in ways that they did not matter everywhere else at Wits. I could bring my whole self, flaws and all, to the table without fear of judgment or being made to feel like I was lacking or less than. In short, my humanity was affirmed in the same way that it had been instilled in me by my family and community when I was growing up. As painful as it was to look back on my time at Wits, I was really only scratching the surface when I wrote that article. Upon reading Malaika Azania's latest offering, Corridors of Death, The Struggle to Survive in Historically White Institutions, I was forced to go much deeper in order to exorcise demons I was not aware were still with me from that period of my life. I want to use this video essay to demonstrate one of the many points that Azania makes in her book. That universities are not the safe havens that abound with opportunities for self-improvement, upward mobility, and community development that we are made to believe they are. Rather, they are simply microcosms of the rest of society, and as such, perpetuate the same anti-black, white supremacist, sexist, capitalist, patriarchal sentiments that the rest of society maintains. Corridors of Death opens with the story behind student activist and SRC member Kensani Maseko's final tweet. Azania writes, "These were the date of her birth and the date of her death, respectively. Kensani's death sent shockwaves across South Africa. It sparked a dialogue about rape culture at Rhodes University, as well as higher learning institutions in general. But beyond the conversation on rape culture, the death of Kensani also sparked a dialogue on mental health in higher learning institutions, and although this dialogue was not centered on race relations, it was an entry point for a discussion that would ultimately center the race element of mental health. The issue of mental health in South Africa can be traced back to the initial founding of this country. The de-agrarianization of what is today called South Africa started shortly after the British conquered the nations that existed in the area, like the Zulu, the Marota, the Ngqika, the Batlaping, and the Barolong. As a result, black people in South Africa could no longer work the land in order to feed themselves and create their own wealth. In addition, the British colonial authorities imposed taxes that forced them to move to urban areas in order to earn money to pay these taxes. After the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1911, this process of de-agrarianization intensified and a new black proletariat was born following the destructive Natives Land Act of 1913. The impact of this piece of legislation was expressed most poignantly by the opening sentence of Saul Plaatje's native life in South Africa. Awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. These events led to the forced migrant labor system that has come to characterize South African history from the early 20th century to the present. The traumas that have been brought about by this system are still felt to this day. This is something that is so well demonstrated by Khumbule Khaya, a reality show on SABC1 that seeks to reunite families with their long-lost loved ones. Very often, this separation was as a result of family members having to migrate to a big city for their family's survival. This separation led to the breaking up of African family units. Fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, sisters, and brothers were forced to leave their families behind just so they could enrich the South African white elites while earning a pittance. This continues today. One of the differences is that the people being enriched are now also black. Azania lays down this historical foundation in the 4th chapter of her book in order to make sense of the statistics that demonstrate one of the biggest consequences of this history, the brokenness of South African society. The General Household Survey, released by Statistics South Africa in 2017, indicated that more than 50% of children under the age of 18 have absent fathers. This was earlier expressed in a 2013 report by the South African Institute of Race Relations and in another 2010 study that showed that black South African children are the greatest casualty of this trend, with 51% of them living without their biological fathers. The communities from whence we come are broken precisely because our families are broken. And this pattern, because history shapes much of our present, is evident even in modern families where black children born post-apartheid are still being raised largely in single-parent households. But it is not only in single-parent households where so many of us are raised, but also in extended family units. A Statistics South Africa report titled The Missing Piece of the Puzzle, published in 2018, indicated that the percentage of children aged 0 to 6 who lived in extended family units is more than those children living in nuclear family units. When this is broken down in terms of racial composition, among black children, 44.6% lived in nuclear families, whereas the majority, 55.3%, lived in extended families. By contrast, 76% of white children primarily lived in a nuclear family and 24% lived in extended family units. What this means is that many black children are growing up in homes where they live with relatives and relatives' children, often because of absent parents, limited resources, and other such factors. This brokenness is socially engineered, and these statistics demonstrate that the social ills that are present in black communities are not because black people are lacking something psychologically, intellectually, and morally. We are living the lives that were designed for us by almost 2 centuries of colonialism and apartheid and continue to be upheld in the democratic dispensation. Azania makes this point succinctly when she quotes Drexel Deal's memoir, The Fight of My Life is Wrapped Up in My Father. It's evident then, when one looks at the stats, that we don't have a teenage pregnancy problem and we don't have a street gang problem. I will even suggest that we don't have a drug and alcohol problem, nor do we have a crime problem. Rather, these are only the symptoms that we are experiencing, and the real problem is broken homes that result in broken lives. Azania also makes the point that this brokenness is exacerbated by the multiple physical and psychological traumas of South Africa's violent history and the new democratic dispensation. All of this has resulted in a society that is so steeped in mental illness that one of the ways it copes is through heinous acts of violence, particularly violence aimed against women, children, and queer people. Black people in South Africa have only ever been seen as cheap labor since the 19th century. It is no surprise then that the only kind of development that we find from the government has to do with preparing our young people for the labor force. Because South Africa's youth unemployment is so high, of course this makes sense. As Azania aptly points out, exclusion from the economy is at the heart of the crisis of the black condition in South Africa. However, dealing with the problem of the black condition demands more than the availing of economic opportunities. It also demands meaningfully investing in the establishment of facilities in townships that aid in such things as general trauma counseling. At the present moment, these facilities either do not exist or remain inadequate as a result of a lack of funding. Universities serve as an interesting case study where these issues of mental illness show up. Their insufficient mental health services are a reflection of what we see in the broader society. Azania writes, according to the Career Counseling and Development Unit at Wits University, the prominent psychological issues students face include depression, anxiety, bereavement, academic and financial problems, as well as stress and trauma, including childhood trauma. She writes further, mental health in the Black community in general is a subject we do not speak about enough, and as a result, narratives around it being a white people's sickness continue to find expression. What this does is perpetuate problematic ideas about how Black people who suffer from mental illness are strange or even worse, attention seekers. As a microcosm of our society, universities become sites of this perpetuated violence, and therefore sites of mental trauma for Black students, most of whom do not have coping mechanisms or a support structure to negotiate their debilitating conditions. There is very little data about the number of university students who die by suicide in South Africa, but anecdotal evidence tied to an international study that was published in 2020 suggests that suicide among students in South Africa is a cause for great concern. The South African researchers studied a group of first-year students from two large South African universities, and they found that approximately 1/3 of students reported symptoms of psychological distress in the past year. They found that 30.6% of students had thought of suicide in the past 12 months. 16.6% had made a suicide plan, and 2.4% had attempted suicide. These rates are markedly higher than those found in the country's general population. These are also marginally higher than rates typically found among students in other parts of the world. The researchers also found that the most common risk factors for suicide include untreated mental health problems, social isolation, financial difficulties, hazardous substance abuse, and interpersonal conflict. Feeling hopeless, ashamed, powerless, and trapped also increases the risk of suicide, particularly if these painful feelings are unbearable and appear to have no end. Both the researchers and Azania point out that much more research is needed in South Africa around issues of mental illness if the scarce mental health resources in the broader society are to be improved. This parallel between society's treatment of Black people and the violence of historically white universities is something that is continuously illustrated in the book. Azania demonstrates such a clear connection between the response of agents of the state to Black protesters during Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, the EndSARS protests in Nigeria, the continued service delivery protests in South Africa, and the response of police and private security towards students during the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall protests. The violence that was meted out on these Black students did not only cost some their lives, it inflicted serious bodily harm and resulted in psychological trauma that many have still not recovered from. Whether it is in the broader society or at universities, Corridors of Death shows us that Black people are treated as disposable and worth nothing. In chapter 13 and 14, Azania juxtaposes the experiences of Black professionals in broader society and at universities to show us that even the most brilliant Black academics are not valued in the academy. She does this by sharing the experiences of lawyers, accountants, and a teacher of feeling alienated and ignored as though their contributions were of little value and their ideas of little significance. Azania tells us that it is a working culture that is deeply embedded in the subjugation and undermining of the intellectual credibility of Black professionals. This constant humiliation and degradation can cause mental challenges and in many instances can also be life-threatening. It is an experience that many have written about, from those in the corporate space like Sihle Bolani and Eusebius McKaiser, to those who work in universities like Phumla Gola and Grace Kuno. Azania has written this remarkable book for South Africans, those who were sent to these white institutions so they could have better economic opportunities, those parents and family members who unknowingly sent their children to a spiritual, mental, and psychological slaughter, those who survived, those who did not, and those who are still part of these institutions. She has written it for all of us in the hope that we will not only find healing in reading it, but that we will continue to strive for a better South Africa. She writes, "The truth is that South Africa, if it is to become a better country, must change radically. In this South Africa, black people must not grow into adults who are recovering from their childhoods. In this South Africa, everyone must belong, truly and fully, to the human race." Corridors of Death is not an easy book to read, particularly for those of us who have gone through some of the experiences that Azania discusses. For me, reading it was a cathartic experience because it so clearly demonstrated to me that I was not imagining or over-exaggerating some of the experiences I have had. It is an important book that has started a much-needed conversation in South African discourse. Hello everyone, once again thank you so much for watching. I just want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude for the continued love and support that you are all giving to this channel. The work that we do is quite difficult, and it gives us all immense joy to know that it is being appreciated by all of you out there. Have a great day or night or whenever it is that you are watching this video. See you next time.